Today, I want to tell you about what is possibly the worst medical trial in modern history. Worst in terms of its bizarre practices, worst in terms of its potentially fraudulent reporting of results, and worst of all, its potential harm that it has caused to a very vulnerable group of people. So, find a comfy chair, sit back, and relax. Today's video is long, but I promise you it's worth it. So, let's jump into this study. It's called the PACE trial. So the PACE trial took place in the UK and it cost a massive £5 million, which at the time was about $8 million US. And all of that money was used to fund research into potential treatments for a condition known as ME, or myalgic encephalomyelitis. So in order to explain the PACE trial, I first need to give you a quick overview of ME as a condition. So let's do that first. So ME is a condition that affects millions of people worldwide. And it's a condition that is most famously characterized by its extreme tiredness. Patients with ME describe their tiredness as overwhelming, to the point where many of them have to crawl into bed and stay there all day long, unable to participate in normal day-to-day activities like work and school. This extreme tiredness tends to last over a prolonged period of time, which is why this condition is often referred to as chronic fatigue syndrome, or CFS. In fact, that's what the authors of the PACE trial called it in their study. Chronic fatigue syndrome. But a lot of people with ME don't like the term chronic fatigue syndrome because it doesn't fully capture the extent and the variety of symptoms that people with ME actually have. Some other symptoms that people have are, for example, mental tiredness, or brain fog, it is sometimes called. That's when you have a lack of mental clarity, you forget words and places and what you're talking about, and you struggle to pay attention to things. That's another symptom of ME. In addition to physical and mental tiredness, another very important symptom that people with ME have is something called post-exertional malaise, or PEM. Post-exertional malaise is when people do exercise, but they don't recover from that exercise like most, healthy people do. Instead, if people have post-exertional malaise, that means that after they do exercise, their tiredness gets worse, their condition gets worse, and it actually means that they become more debilitated afterwards. So that's a very quick overview of the main symptoms of ME. It's a condition that we don't really know how to treat very well yet. There are also other symptoms that people experience too, but I won't get into them in this video. But just to give you an idea, that's the kind of condition people have, and as you can tell, it is very debilitating and very horrible. However, despite how horrible this condition is, people with ME often suffer from a lot of stigma. From the people that I talk to when researching this video, it's very common for them to hear things like, oh, ME is all in your head, or you believe you're sick and so you are sick, and essentially there is a group of people out there who don't believe that ME is a real condition. And one of the main studies that they use to fuel this argument is the PACE trial that I'm going to talk to you about today. They recruited 640 participants from England who, according to their measures, which we'll get to, had ME. And these 640 participants were then split into 4 different groups. So the first group was essentially a control group. These people saw a specialist clinician, as did every other group, but they didn't receive any other additional treatment. The second group was called the adaptive pacing therapy group, and this group was encouraged to do something called pacing, which is a practice that a lot of people with ME do generally. The idea behind pacing, as the name suggests, is to pace yourself. Essentially, people with ME try not to go outside what they call their energy envelope, basically the set amount of energy that they have per day, and not overexert themselves beyond that, because they know that if they do, then they'll be experiencing that post-exertional malaise that I mentioned earlier, and their condition will get worse. So that's what people who do pacing do. So then there were the other 2 conditions, and these were the 2 that clearly the authors were hoping to see the best results from. One was called the Cognitive Behavioral Therapy Group, or CBT group. These people were encouraged to see a therapist, and by working with their therapist, they were supposed to address their fear of activity. The idea behind this is that perhaps people with ME have developed a strong fear of doing things, and so they end up doing less than they're actually capable of. And then there's the 4th group, which is the Graded Exercise Therapy group, and this one is perhaps the most controversial of all of the different things being tested. Because in this group, patients were encouraged to actually engage in more exercise. Now, as I said earlier, people with ME try to typically avoid doing exercise because they have a fear of post-exertional malaise, overexerting themselves and making their condition worse. But the people in the Graded Exercise Therapy group were actually encouraged to do exercise. And the thinking behind that is that, well, if people with ME believe that exercise will make their condition worse, then they end up not doing exercise, which then makes their body deconditioned to that exercise, so that the next time they try to engage in activity, it becomes harder to them, which means that they then have have more fear of doing activity and then they decondition even more. So by encouraging them on this graded exercise therapy program to gradually increase the amount of exercise that they do, that they should be able to build up their physical ability again and then maybe get back to full health. And it makes sense if you believe that ME is a condition that is all in people's heads. But if you're someone who actually suffers from ME and you believe that ME is a proper biological condition that you have, then the idea of doing graded exercise therapy sounds like a terrible one, because basically you're going to make people's condition worse because you're going to be exacerbating that post-exertional malaise that I talked about earlier. So those are the 4 groups being tested. The trial runs for 1 year, and then after 1 year they report the results of their trial. So what were the results? Well, according to what was originally published in The Lancet, the authors said that graded exercise therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy worked the best both in terms of the subjective measures that they did to measure people's subjective perception of their symptoms, and best in terms of one of their objective measures. And perhaps most controversially of all, they then published another paper based off this trial called Recovery from Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, where they indicated that people on the graded exercise therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy group were actually the most likely to be fully recovered from their ME condition. Now, this was highly controversial because people with ME were looking at the study from the outside and saying, what do you mean people were able to recover from ME when in none of your 4 groups are people having any sort of actual medical intervention? It's just therapy, exercise, or pacing. But nevertheless, the results of this study caught a lot of people's attention, including the media. A lot of major media outlets reported on the results of this study, including this article in the New York Times that said, well, according to this new research, apparently people with ME can recover from their condition as long as they just do some exercise and maybe see a therapist. Well, the person who wrote this New York Times article was called David Tuller. And after he published this article, people began writing to him. They wrote to him saying things like, David, I'm usually a huge fan of your articles, a huge fan of your work, but this one seems really off the mark. The results of this study that you're describing here are completely contrary to my lived experience with ME. And so David Tuller, who by the way has a doctorate in public health from Berkeley and an academic position there, began to use his expertise in investigative journalism to look into this PACE trial. And the more he looked into it, the more problems he found. And so since his article got published in the New York Times, David Tuller has been one of the biggest voices against this PACE trial and the harm that it's potentially causing to the ME community. And I was lucky enough to actually talk to David Tuller about the PACE trial. So he and I are now going to outline 5 major problems with this trial. There's a lot more than 5, but here are the 5 biggest ones in my opinion. So the first major flaw with this study was the recruitment criteria that they used to recruit participants into the study in the first place. Because in order to be recruited into this study, you had to meet a couple of different conditions, and the main one that was being used to recruit people was something called the Oxford criteria for having ME. The Oxford criteria sounds very official because it has the word Oxford attached to it, but actually it's a very poor definition of what ME is. Because like I explained earlier, ME is a multi-symptom health condition, but the Oxford criteria is a 1-symptom definition of ME, which is very problematic, as David Tuller explains here.
The primary criteria they were using were the so-called Oxford criteria. So these were developed in 1991 by the UK people who decided that really chronic fatigue syndrome was really just extended prolonged fatigue that was, could be disabling. So their definition in the Oxford criteria is 6 months of unexplained fatigue. Unexplained fatigue is one of the most common things that people present to clinicians with, along with pain. And it's 6 months of unexplained fatigue. It could be a proxy for many, many things. If you actually believe there's a clinical entity that's distinct called chronic fatigue syndrome, then it's a terrible set of criteria because it'll be conflated with many, many other things, including undiagnosed depression, undiagnosed anxiety disorders, other kinds of things which can generate feelings of fatigue. 6 months of fatigue is a terribly inadequate way to assess somebody if you believe that there's a clinical entity called chronic fatigue syndrome, or that what we now call ME.
So that was the first problem with this study, the overly broad recruitment criteria that meant that a decent number of the people in this trial probably didn't actually have ME. But the second problem with this trial was the newsletters. And this is one of the things that the authors did that made me think that this study was just really bizarre and honestly poorly run. Because during the 52 weeks that the people were on this trial, the authors decided to disseminate a bunch of newsletters to the patients about how the trial is going. And that practice just seems really weird. And indeed, this is one of the most highly criticized parts of this entire study. So on screen now, you can see some of the newsletters that were sent out to participants. And there's a couple of things that they put in these newsletters that seem highly problematic and might be influencing their results. So the first thing to pay attention to is the bunch of testimonies that they decided to put on the newsletter from patients on the trial saying how the trial is going. And they put a lot of positive things in here. Some of these testimonies say things like, the therapy was excellent and very helpful, or they say things like, the therapist is very helpful and gives me very useful advice and also motivates me. And this is problematic because the main way that they were assessing the outcomes of this trial was through a subjective questionnaire. And when the outcome of your study is subjective, then these kind of testimonials can influence the subjective perception of how well your treatment is going. If you were on the graded exercise therapy group and you weren't feeling any benefits from what you were doing, but you see a bunch of testimonials from other people on the trial saying, oh, this therapy is working really well for me. Well, guess what? That might influence your results. And the authors of the trial have defended this criticism by saying that, well, they don't specify in the testimonies what treatment group the people who are giving the testimony belong to. And so it should influence all 4 of the groups equally. But that is simply an assumption that they have absolutely no backing for. They have no idea how these kind of testimonies will influence the different groups. They are assuming that it influences everybody equally, but that is a big assumption and something which I think should never have been done in what is supposed to be a robust medical trial like this. But these testimonies aren't even the worst part of the newsletter, in my opinion. The worst part, in my opinion, was this section at the end of the newsletter that talks about the new NICE guidelines for people with ME. NICE, if you don't know, is a medical body. It stands for the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. It's a very authoritative body in the medical world. And in this newsletter, in the middle of the trial, by the way, they are saying the new NICE guidelines intend to provide a framework for healthcare services working for people with CFS/ME. They are based on the best available evidence and consensus where evidence is sparse. And then they say recommended therapies include cognitive behavioral therapy, graded exercise therapy, and activity management. So it's pretty obvious that putting something like this as a newsletter for people to read in the middle of your medical trial where the outcome is subjective could influence the subjective results of your trial. But again, the authors defend it with a very similar argument, saying that, well, cognitive behavioral therapy, graded exercise therapy, and activity management, those are the 3 things that we're testing for, so it should affect all 3 groups equally. But again, that is a huge assumption, and also it's false, because cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the treatment groups, graded exercise therapy is one of the treatment groups, but the other treatment group, the one that they're saying is activity management, was not called activity management. Instead, it was called the adaptive pacing therapy group. It had a different name. And so it is highly unlikely that every single person on the adaptive pacing therapy group realized that activity management was the same thing. And so this kind of message probably wouldn't influence all 3 groups equally, I would assume. And of course, there's the 4th condition, the control group, who isn't getting any kind of shout out here. And so again, this kind of practice is really weird. A lot of people have described it as amateurish, and I'm inclined to agree with them. It should never have happened and most likely had an influence on the result of this trial. Okay, so let's move on to the 3rd criticism of this medical trial, which is the reporting of the objective measures. So you remember me saying earlier that according to what was originally published in The Lancet, graded exercise therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy work the best in terms of the subjective measures and one of the objective measures. The reason why I phrased it like that is because in this study, there were subjective measures and then there were 4 objective measures. And if I was to ask you, hey, there's this really important medical trial going on and there are subjective and objective outcomes that are being measured, which ones are you more interested in? I think most people would say I'm more interested in the objective measures because, well, they're objective. But for some reason, in the original paper that was published in The Lancet, and of course that was the one that got the most media attention, they only decided to report on one of their 4 objective measures. So which one did they report on? Well, the one that they reported on was called the 6-minute walking test. And as the name suggests, the way that this measure is done is that people walk for 6 minutes and see how far they could walk, and then that distance is measured, and that is like one of the objective measures to see how much people have recovered from their condition. So why in the original Lancet paper did they only report on this one 6-minute walking test and not the other 3 objective measures? Well, they gave some excuse in the paper about the other 3 not being good or not relevant anymore for whatever reason, but it's pretty obvious that the real reason they chose not to report on them is because those other 3 conditions didn't produce a statistically significant result. In those other 3 objective measures, there's no statistically significant difference between the 4 groups, and the only one that did produce a statistically significant result was the 6-minute walking test, where the people who did graded exercise therapy increased the amount that they could walk in 6 minutes a little bit more than everybody else. And that sounds like a pretty good outcome, right, for the people who did graded exercise therapy, but it's important to make a distinction here between statistical significance and what is known as clinical significance. Just because something is statistically significant doesn't mean that it actually has any real, felt benefits for people who are actually suffering from this condition in a clinical sense. So when we look at the actual numbers that were reported from the 6-minute walking test, we can see that at the end of the 52-week trial of doing graded exercise therapy, the average walking distance for people in this group was only 379 meters, which honestly in 6 minutes isn't very far. If you were to compare that number to a normal healthy population, which I did, I found this other study that did 6-minute walking tests with a healthy population, and they found that your average 70 to 80-year-old in a healthy population can walk 514 meters in the same 6-minute test. So what the authors are saying is that the people in the PACE trial, who by the way are about 39 years old on average, these people at the end of their 52-week intervention weren't even able to come remotely close to the distance walked by a 70 to 80-year-old. That improvement to me is pretty pathetic and quite obviously not clinically significant, but that isn't something which they talk about when they reported their results in their original paper. So the objective measure that they reported on is complete nonsense. But let's move on to the fourth criticism, which is the recovery paper, because this is the one which captured my imagination, which I think will capture your imagination too, and was the whole reason why I wanted to make this video in the first place. So let's talk about this recovery paper. So like I said earlier, after they published that first paper in the Lancet, they then published this paper later, which was called Recovery from Chronic Fatigue Syndrome After Treatments Given in the PACE Trial. So just this title alone raises some eyebrows, because people looking at this trial from the outside are saying there's no actual medical intervention here, it's just therapy or exercise or pacing. How can people recover from their medical condition of ME with these kind of things? But according to the authors, that's what they're reporting on. So what did they write in this paper? Well, similar to the first paper, they said that people who did graded exercise therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy were the most likely to recover from their condition. In order to make a claim like that, that means you need to have some sort of criteria for defining recovery, some kind of threshold that the participants in your study have to meet in order to be classified as recovered, right? And when people like David Tuller looked at the thresholds that were being used, it was an absolute joke. So how did they classify recovery? Well, you remember me talking earlier about the recruitment criteria to get into the study. I mentioned the Oxford criteria being one of the main criteria that they used, and that one was really bad. Well, another criteria that they had to meet in order to get into this study was to get below a certain score on something called the SF-36 physical function scale. And all the SF-36 physical function scale is essentially a questionnaire that asks you a bunch of questions about how your physical function is. It asks questions like, well, you can see it on screen here now. It's like, can you climb stairs? Can you carry objects? Things like that. And depending on how you answer this questionnaire, you get a score from 0 to 100. 0 being the least physically able and 100 being the most physically able. And so in order to be recruited into this study, you had to get a SF-36 function score of less than 60. That was how they classified people as being sufficiently disabled to enter the study. But the problem was, as they started to recruit participants into this study, they weren't getting the numbers that they needed. And so midway through the recruitment process, they decided to increase this threshold from 60 to 65. Okay, fair enough. You're allowed to do that. They've now changed the threshold from 60 to 65. If you get below that, you're sufficiently disabled in order to enter this study. But when it came to the recovery criteria, one of the criteria that people had to meet was to get a score above 60 on this SF-36 physical function scale. So can you see the problem here? If you had to get a score of 65 or below in order to be disabled enough to enter the trial, but then need a score of 60 or above in order to be classified as recovered from the trial, then doesn't that mean that anyone who scored between 60 and 65 when they were recruited were simultaneously disabled enough to enter the trial and recovered from their disability already before the trial even began? Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And I thought this was absolutely ridiculous. And so when I talked to David Tuller about this, I asked him, do we actually know how many of the participants actually fell into this sort of problem? And we did know.
Oh, they found out that it was released that 13% of the participants in the study entered the study already having met the outcome thresholds for physical function.
I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous that this is even possible. I've never heard of another medical trial in my life that had overlapping disability and recovery from disability criteria. It is absolutely insane. So how did this even happen? Like, how did the authors even make this a possibility? Well, let me explain. So before the PACE trial took place, the authors of the PACE trial first had to write a protocol, essentially saying what they intended to do in this study so that they can then present that to people who will then fund their study. They receive the funding from it, and then they go and actually do the thing that they said they were going to do. And so on their original protocol that they, the thing that they received funding for, they said that their outcome threshold for the SF-36 physical function scale would be more than 85, a score of more than or equal to 85. That would be the classification for recovery. But when it came to the actual recovery paper and how they reported on the results, they ended up actually changing that score from 85 to 60, and this was their justification. They said, we changed our original protocol's threshold score from being within a normal range on the measure from a score of more than or equal to 85 to a lower score, as that threshold would mean that approximately half the general working population would fall outside the normal range. We derived a mean score of 84 for the whole sample, giving a normal range of 60 or above for physical function. Now, if you don't know anything about statistics, that sounds perfectly reasonable. That sounds like they know what they're talking about. But anyone who knows statistics will be hearing that and thinking that is a completely bogus argument for lowering your threshold score from 85 to 60. Why? Because you can't derive this kind of normal range if your underlying data doesn't have a normal distribution. Let me explain. So in statistics, you have different types of distributions, right? And the most common one is something called a normal distribution, which I'm sure you've heard of before. A normal distribution looks like this. It's a bell curve. Starts small, gets larger in the middle, and then drops off. But when we think about people's physical function over their adult life, do you think that that follows a bell curve pattern? Do people generally have very poor physical function when they're, 18 to 25, and then peak in around middle age and then drop off towards the end? No, of course not, right? People are at their peak of their physical function when they're young, when they're in 18 to 25, and then it slopes downwards. And so to apply this kind of statistical technique, which is only appropriate for when your underlying data is a normal distribution, is completely inappropriate. And to prove to you that that's what physical function looks like, and I'm not just talking out of my ass, I actually found a paper that got people in Wales to do an SF-36 physical function scale. And as you can see, yep, just as I described, people's physical function is very high when they're young, and then it drops down. And that, as you can visually see, is not a bell curve. So this kind of statistical technique is completely inappropriate, and that's how they ended up with such an inappropriate threshold for recovery. But the even worse thing about them using this technique, which is only applicable to a normal distribution, is that they then manipulated the meaning of the word normal when they reported on the results. Because normal in terms of statistics and normal in terms of clinical significance, like as in not having ME, is a completely different meaning, right? It has nothing to do with each other. But yet the authors of the study manipulated the meaning of the word normal in order to make it sound like, oh, these people in our study, they got back to normal. Here's David Teller explaining.
At the press conference, one of the lead authors, Trudy Chalder, referred to people falling within the normal range as getting back to normal. That's not what normal range means. Normal range has absolutely nothing. Let's just say this has absolutely nothing with normal in terms of clinical terms. It's a statistical term and has nothing to do with it, either because she's stupid or because she's very smart and intentional. Deliberately or unintentionally distorted the meaning of the term normal range, which was already a function of fraudulent statistics, in my view, and then turned it into getting back to normal.
And the fifth and final criticism, and what is perhaps the most worrying of all, was that the authors of this trial had egregious conflicts of interest with the participants who were taking part in it, but yet they didn't disclose this to the participants before they engaged in the trial. Here's David Teller explaining once again.
Three main PACE authors have had long careers as consultants or advisors to disability insurance companies, including, as I said, the Department for Work and Pensions, sponsor of the PACE trial. Why would they do that? Well, they don't want to pay much pensions. I mean, they don't want to pay out disability payments. Of course, that's why they did it. The implication was that this would prove these treatments would get patients back to work. That's why this, occupational outcome presumably was one of their outcomes, and it was bust. And, Peter White, gave a whole seminar about this, and Peter White has, one of the co-authors, signed notes saying if this person hasn't had graded exercise therapy or cognitive behavior therapy, they shouldn't get benefits. Now, did they advise patients, participants in their trial, that they had this massive conflict of interest? No, they did not. When you write a protocol, you agree to you're going to abide by this and this and this kind of set of regulations, including various ethics codes. They agreed to abide, as many researchers do, with the Declaration of Helsinki. The Declaration of Helsinki is a human rights document written after the World War II to protect subjects of human subjects of research. And it has a whole sorts of provisions about what researchers are supposed to do to protect human subjects of research. The iteration that was in force at 2005 specifically required researchers to inform participants of any possible conflicts of interest or institutional affiliations. Now, any possible conflicts of interest is quite broad. Okay, I understand that. However, nobody forced these people in their protocol to put down that they were going to adhere to the Declaration of Helsinki. Nonetheless, that's what they put down, and that's what they received approval and money for. They got money for their protocol with that in it. Now, when they did their consent forms, they did not tell anybody in the consent forms about these possible conflicts of interest. In other words, that they were doing this as advisors to disability insurance companies.
So those for me are my 5 biggest concerns with this study. There was certainly a lot more that have been levied against the authors of the PACE trial. I mean, this entire thing was a train wreck from start to finish. But for me, these were the 5 most egregious ones and the ones I wanted to share with you in today's video. So what do you make of the PACE trial? A good use of $8 million? I'll tell you what the new NICE guidelines think of the trial. They seem to have completely tossed out the conclusions of this trial into the trash. They say about cognitive behavioral therapy that cognitive behavioral therapy can help patients manage their symptoms, but that it is not a route to recovery for people with ME. And when it comes to graded exercise therapy, they explicitly do not recommend it to people who have ME, despite the conclusions of this trial. Now, when I reached out to the authors of the trial, they wanted me to point out to you that these new NICE guidelines have also been highly criticized, and they also wanted me to point out the fact that despite all of this criticism, the PACE trial has never been retracted from the Lancet. So, the Lancet, your move. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you to David Tuller for helping me with this video, and also to my subscriber Arthur, who has ME and was the whole inspiration for this video in the first place. Thank you again for watching, guys. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.